Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Examining the Public Health Risks of Carcinogens in Consumer Products. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today marks our subcommittee's first hearing. The Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy was created to focus attention on the pocketbook issues that matter the most to Americans: economic opportunity and fairness, consumer health and safety, and the overall quality of life. We will do this first and foremost by asking tough questions and following the facts wherever they lead. Today our focus is on a group of widely used personal care consumer products that contain talc, a mineral that manufacturers put in baby powder for infants, makeup for teenage girls, and personal care products for people of all ages. Now, why is this issue important right now? First, recent reports claim that Johnson & Johnson, a large maker of personal care products, was aware for decades that its talc products sometimes contained asbestos, a carcinogen that has killed thousands of miners and shipyard workers. And separately, the FDA recently issued health advisories regarding cosmetics marketed by Justice and Claire's to children, also containing asbestos. Let's be clear. There is no question that exposure to asbestos is hazardous to human health. And geologists know that asbestos can be found in rock formations that also contain talc. Yet, the FDA cannot order any manufacturers to recall these personal care or cosmetics products that potentially contain asbestos. The question is, why? Because a loophole in the statute that empowers the FDA to regulate personal care products and cosmetics does not allow the FDA to require necessary recalls. Thankfully, some manufacturers, like Claire's, has volunteered to recall products the FDA has found to contain asbestos, which I thoroughly commend. But FDA authority generally remains weak. In fact, product recalls, mandatory risk labeling, and adverse event reports are just a few of the processes in which compliance with FDA guidelines is entirely voluntary for the cosmetics industry. This is a statutory problem that needs reform, and I expect the Energy and Commerce Committee, under the leadership of Chairman Frank Pallone, will focus like a laser on that problem to protect consumers. But juries across America are not waiting for Congress to act. In fact, juries have awarded verdicts to victims and survivors who have suffered or died from ovarian cancer that was possibly caused by talcum baby powder. Many of those juries have assessed punitive damages against manufacturers for failing to warn consumers of talcum powder's ovarian cancer risk. Today, we are joined by women and their families from across the country who suffer from ovarian cancer, which they attribute to long-time use of talcum baby powder. One of these families is the Browning family from my home state of Illinois. Anthony and Alyssa Browning, thank you both for being here today on behalf of your mother, Gloria Browning. I extend my sincerest condolences to you and your family. Additionally, one of our witnesses today, Mr. Salter, is the surviving son of a deceased ovarian cancer patient. He will testify to what he and his mother's doctors believe caused his mother's death. Mr. Salter, I extend our sympathies to you as well, and I want to personally thank you for joining us here today. We will also hear from a distinguished epidemiologist, Dr. Ann McTiernan, who has conducted extensive analyses of the scientific data on talc and asbestos. We will also hear from the Environmental Working Group, which is devoted to consumer health and education to help us evaluate the problems in the federal regulation of personal care products. We are also listening to what the largest maker of talcum body powders, Johnson & Johnson, says about the safety of their products. In preparing for this hearing, my staff has discussed the company's detection methods, manufacturing and mining processes, and the health risk data with senior executives in their company. And we will continue to gather facts from them as well. The average adult uses 9 personal care products daily in this country. 9. Consumers use these products trusting that they are safe and will not harm themselves or their families. Today's hearing is just our first step in protecting consumers from potentially carcinogenic products. The American people deserve nothing less. Now the chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Cloud of Texas, for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Let me say at the outset, congratulations, Chairman, on your chairmanship and on this first meeting of the subcommittee. I do look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
And I know we're just getting to know each other, but I know enough about both of us to know that even our most important role is that of being a father. And because of that, we keep in mind our families and the families we represent, and that's one of the things that makes this such an important issue today. The issue we're discussing today is particularly important not only because of the potential harm for individuals, but because of how commonplace consumer products are. I'm confident that everyone in this room has used several consumer products this morning, or at least I hope so, the safety of which we largely take for granted. When a problem like the potential contamination of consumer products with carcinogens becomes apparent, one of the first questions that comes to mind is, what is the federal government's role in addressing it? I think we can all agree on this. If a company knowingly puts contaminated products on the marketplace for consumers to buy and use, that's a bad actor, and bad actors should be held accountable. The government should engage in fact-finding and determine the level of risk posed to consumers by these contaminated process, which is a process I hope we begin today. Any federal government action should be guided by the best available science and based on real, quantifiable risk to consumers, not by fear or desire to simply act. It should be tailored to the problem at hand and designed to limit unintended or secondary consequences. We need only to look at recent history to find instances of government regulation having the opposite effect from what was intended. In a response to the 2008 financial crisis, Congress took the expansive action and passed Dodd-Frank to address banks that were too big to fail. But according to the Wall Street Journal, the 3 largest U.S. banks by assets have taken in more than $2.4 trillion of domestic deposits over the last 10 years. That growth is more than the total assets held by the 8 largest banks in 2007, the year before the crisis began. In other words, we took banks that were too big to fail and we made them bigger. And why does this happen? It happens because regulatory complexity favors large, established companies who can better absorb new compliance costs. It creates barriers to entry, and so there are fewer new companies being formed, and it drives consolidation, concentrating risk into fewer institutions who have bigger roles in the economy. So as we work on this very real situation, I hope we can keep in mind scalable solutions as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. And I do thank our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Look forward to your testimony. Thank you for being here. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. Now I want to welcome our witnesses, Dr. Ann McTiernan, MD, PhD, a member of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, Scott Faber, the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Environmental Working Group, and Marvin Salter, who is the son of a deceased ovarian cancer patient. If the witnesses would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. If you could put up your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may put your right hands down. Let the record show that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them. There's a timing system here, counting down from 5. You start with the green light, then you go to yellow light and red light, but unlike with stoplights, you have to speed up when you see yellow, not slow down. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Dr. McTiernan, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony for 5 minutes.
Chairman Krishnamurthy, Ranking Member Cloud, and members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you for inviting me. My name is Dr. Ann McTiernan. I'm a cancer prevention researcher in the Epidemiology Program, Division of Public Health Sciences at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. I'm also a research professor at the University of Washington Schools of Public Health and Medicine. I'm not representing the Fred Hutchinson or the University of Washington in my presentation of testimony this morning to the subcommittee. I'm an internal medicine physician and an epidemiologist, and my research focuses on cancer epidemiology and prevention, particularly cancers in women. I was asked to give testimony today because I've conducted a thorough and systematic review of the science linking use of talcum powder products with risk for ovarian cancer. As part of this review, I prepared an expert report on behalf of consumers for an ongoing multi-district litigation on talcum powder products as causes of ovarian cancer. My scientific review focused primarily on the epidemiologic research. So epidemiologists look at large groups of people with a disease and compare them to people without that disease to look for what might be causing the disease. The American Cancer Society and the U.S. National Cancer Institute estimate that in 2019, over 22,000 women will receive a diagnosis of ovarian cancer, and over 13,000 will die of ovarian cancer. There's no established method for screening for ovarian cancer. As a result, most women are diagnosed at an advanced, less treatable stage. There's also no method established for preventing ovarian cancer other than surgical removal of the ovaries. Therefore, it's critical to identify causes of ovarian cancer in order to prevent this serious disease. My review identified 38 high-quality epidemiologic studies conducted over the past 40 years. These studies asked women about the use of talcum powder products in the genital area and tested associations with risk of ovarian cancer. Together, these studies included over 14,000 women with ovarian cancer, particularly epithelial cancer, which is the most common type, and an even greater number of women without ovarian cancer. Most of these studies were conducted in the United States. Ovarian cancer is thought to develop over years. Therefore, a woman's experience in her younger and middle years can affect her risk of ovarian cancer decades later. Women have reported use of talcum powder products on sanitary napkins, underwear, and directly to the genital area. In some studies, over 4 in 10 women report ever regularly using these products in the genital area. Summarizing data from all of the published studies consistently shows that women who had ever used talcum powder products in the genital area had statistically significant 22 to 31% increased risk of developing epithelial ovarian cancer compared with women who had never used them. Evidence suggests that these associations hold across diverse race and ethnic groups. These combined analyses also showed that increasing exposure to these products were associated with increasing risk of ovarian cancer. We know from laboratory and clinical studies as well that in humans, talc can migrate from the genital area up to the area of the ovaries and the fallopian tubes. Talc has been shown to cause inflammatory responses in the human body. We know that elevated levels of inflammation are associated with increased risk of ovarian cancer, and all of this provides a biologically plausible pathway by which talcum powder products can cause ovarian cancer. So given the frequency with which asbestos has been found in cosmetic and personal talc products, I reviewed the literature in asbestos as well. And in 2012, the International Agency for Research on Cancer stated that a causal association between asbestos and cancer of the ovary was clearly established. That agency also has classified fibrous talc as a Class 1 carcinogen, the most dangerous type of carcinogen. Given the high prevalence of use of talcum powder products, this level of increase can have profound effects on clinical events and public health. Women need to know about the risks of using talcum powder products in the genital areas, and all consumers need to be warned about the contents of these products, including asbestos and fibrous talcs, so they can make informed decisions about use. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Tiernan. Now, Mr. Faber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cloud, and members of the committee. Let me start by thanking you for holding this hearing, and let me thank the people sitting behind me who have been personally impacted and who are willing to share their stories. The recent news that asbestos was found in facial powders marketed to teens is something that should concern all of us. Unfortunately, cosmetics purchased at stores like Claire's and Justice are not the only products that are likely to contain asbestos. There is always some risk that the products produced with talc will contain this dangerous carcinogen. EWG has found more than 2,000 cosmetics and other personal care products that contain talc, including more than 1,000 loose powders or pressed powders that could pose a risk of being inhaled or absorbed. Even small amounts of asbestos and talc can cause mesothelioma or other diseases many years after exposure. It's not a secret that talc can contain asbestos. Companies have known of this risk since at least the 1950s. Nevertheless, as Commissioner Gottlieb said last week, cosmetic companies have no duty to test for products made with talc for asbestos or to share those test results with FDA, and have no duty to warn consumers of this potential risk. Asbestos is not the only contaminant or chemical of concern in personal care products. Since 2009, cosmetics manufacturers themselves have reported using 88 chemicals linked to cancer, birth defects, or reproductive harm in both men and women. Nevertheless, the FDA is not now required to review and regulate, if necessary, these chemicals, and has very limited authority to do so. While Congress has given the FDA the authority to review and regulate chemicals in food, in colors, in pesticides, Congress has not given the FDA the same power or the resources necessary to address chemicals of concern in cosmetics. As a result, cosmetics have largely fallen into a regulatory black hole. While the FDA has only banned or restricted nine chemicals in cosmetics for safety reasons, more than 40 other nations have banned or restricted more than 1,400 chemicals in cosmetics and other personal care products. While other categories subject to FDA oversight, categories like drugs, medical devices, or food, must register with the FDA, must report ingredients, must report adverse events, cosmetics manufacturers do not have to register with the FDA, do not have to report ingredients, do not have to report adverse events. When products in other categories subject to FDA oversight harm consumers, FDA can stop their production and order a recall. But as we learned last week, FDA can only ask a cosmetics company to recall contaminated products. Since the 1950s, Congress has tried to give FDA the power to oversee the safety of these everyday products, but has so far been stymied. But that may be changing now that cosmetics companies, large and small, have endorsed bipartisan legislation to give FDA these basic powers. All of us use personal care products. Everyday women use, on average, 12 products that contain 168 unique chemicals. Men use, on average, 6 products that contain 85 different chemicals. Most Americans assume that these everyday products are safe, but they would be wrong. That's why I am so grateful, Mr. Chairman, that you are holding this hearing today. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Faber. Mr. Salter, could you present your testimony?
Good morning, Chairman Krishnamurthy, Ranking Member Cloud, and members of the subcommittee. It is a great honor for me to address the subcommittee on behalf of my mother, the late Jacqueline Salter Fox. My mother departed this life on October 6, 2015. Her death came suddenly. At that time, she was doing well. She felt at that point in her battle against ovarian cancer she was winning. Her exact words were, "God wasn't done with me yet." But as we came to learn, like many women who suffer from this deadly disease, victories can be short-lived and celebrations are often cut short. Her disease reoccurred with a vengeance. My mom lost that fight. My mother had me when she was 16 years old, and we were all we had. In many ways, we grew up together. We saw hard times, but we always weathered the storm together. Her illness and eventual death was a storm neither of us was ready for, and one for which remained devastated. I sincerely believe that Johnson & Johnson took my mother's life. We believed in the company and the product specifically. My mother was a true fan. It was a staple in our house and a necessary part of our hygienic routine. It was as natural for her as her brushing her teeth every single day. Baby powder was always in our bathroom cabinets or in our bedroom dressers. It was wherever we were getting dressed. We never realized that what we were using could possibly be harmful. Had we known then what we know now, we would have never brought this into our household. Prior to her diagnosis, my mother, like so many other women, had no symptoms whatsoever. She was diagnosed with the late stage of ovarian cancer in April of 2013. It was a rough time for us, but my mother was the type of woman who never let bad news overtake her joy. She was confident she would beat this disease. She approached her treatment with positive attitude and a big smile. She smiled through her surgery. She smiled through her chemotherapy and even the hair loss that it caused. She cheered up other patients, even though her own body was wrecked with pain and fatigue. She spent her time just as she had spent her life, serving and caring for others. Her spirit was never broken, despite what was happening to her body. She smiled through it all. At some point, she learned that over her 30 years of use of baby powder could have been responsible for her disease. I was not involved in her decision to file a lawsuit, but I supported my mother fully. She told me it was important for her to bring awareness to women about the risks of cancer. She did not want any more women going through what she did. Unfortunately, she did not make her trial. Because I knew how important it was for her, it was important for me to continue that fight. I wanted to make sure that her voice was heard, and I wanted Johnson & Johnson to know her name. I wanted them to know that what a wonderful woman she was and how unfair it was that she was no longer with her family. The trial was eye-opening. The evidence put forth Johnson & Johnson was substantial. They lied to us all. They knew the cancer risks associated with their products but chose to cover it up instead. They protected their products and profits while putting innocent lives at risk. Each day revealed new details about exactly how much they knew and when they knew it. Testing of my mother's tissue revealed the presence of talc. I learned how talc migrates up the female pelvic system and causes chronic inflammation at the surface of the ovaries. I learned how talc particles can infiltrate the lymphatic system and spread throughout the body. I learned that talc is a mineral often found in heavy metals and with asbestos, which are known to be cancer-causing. In the end, the jury saw things as we did. Despite having passion, my mom accomplished her goal of helping educate women everywhere that the baby powder is a serious threat to all women. There have been more trials since my mother's. More juries have seen all the evidence. More news outlets have reported on the issue. The truth is finally coming out, but justice has not been served. Johnson & Johnson has yet to take ownership for what they have done, and they have yet to take one step to make amends to all of us whose lives have been turned upside down because we trusted in this company, and they said their product was safe. Johnson & Johnson continues to market and sell their product that they know to be harmful, and they continue to lie and cover up the truth about its safety. It's past time for Johnson & Johnson to do the right thing. All my mother wanted was for women to know the risk of using baby powder. Johnson & Johnson could voluntarily add a warning to their product today, or better yet, stop selling it altogether. After all this time, it is safe to assume that Johnson & Johnson will not do what needs to be done to protect the public. I ask that this body use whatever power in its disposal to assist in bringing about justice for my mother and for all women and families who have been adversely affected by ovarian cancer caused by Johnson & Johnson baby powder. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salter. I now will begin the questioning. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Dr. McTiernan, I'd like to kind of unpack some of what you had to say with regard to the link between talcum powder use and cancer. Could you explain a little bit about the process by which talcum powder would lead to ovarian cancer?
Well, we know from studies in humans that women who use these products have a higher risk of developing cancer. So the question is, how could this be occurring? One possible way is we know that talc can migrate to the fallopian tubes or ovaries, both of which can initiate the cancer cell developing. One plausible mechanism is inflammation, because talc has been shown to cause an inflammation when it's inside the human body, including in various parts of the body, and that inflammation can induce carcinogenesis. So that is one possible mechanism, but other studies, cell studies where talc has been applied to cells, shows that there are some other mechanisms that could also be working.
How frequent would one have to use talcum powder for cancer-related inflammation to begin to occur? I think you called it carcinogenesis.
It's really not clear how frequently somebody would need to use this product. Theoretically, if one dose is in the particular area and causes an inflammation, that could be sufficient. But when you have more doses, when a person has used this more often and longer, the likelihood of that being introduced into the what we call peritoneal area around the fallopian tubes or ovaries, that likelihood increases. We don't know, there's no particular threshold. There's nothing that says this amount is safe, this amount is not safe.
I'd like to point to a statement that Johnson & Johnson submitted to us yesterday. They said, quote, "Decades of independent scientific testing has confirmed that Johnson & Johnson's cosmetic talc and Johnson's baby powder are safe, are not contaminated with asbestos, and do not cause cancer." Close quote. Without objection, I'd like to enter this letter into the record. Dr. McTiernan, do you agree with the statement that I just made, quoting from Johnson & Johnson's letter to us?
I don't agree in the science aspect of it. I have not seen any of the particular data they're talking about. They're probably talking about two things. One is the epidemiologic studies. So I interpret those data that the use of these products increase risk of ovarian cancer, as do many of the very large combined studies. The other part of that question or that statement, I believe, had to do with testing the product. Well, I am not a mineralogist. I've not conducted those sorts of tests myself. I saw, when I was doing my expert report, I saw both published data and information from the companies that suggested that some of those products could have asbestos or other substances that could be carcinogenic, as well as the talc itself.
Thank you. Before my next question, without objection, I want to enter into the record a letter from Felipe Aviles from Palatine, Illinois, who states his daughter Jeanette regularly used talcum powder in her hygienic routine. Without objection, I'd like to enter her statement into the record, or her father's statement into the record. This past December, Jeanette felt severe abdominal pain. She then got a biopsy and discovered that she had mesothelioma. On January 18, 2019, Jeanette was admitted to the University of Chicago Hospital. She never left and passed away on February 4, 2019. She was sick, diagnosed, and gone all within a few months. Without objection, I'm also entering into the record a joint letter from 10 additional Chicago residents who are relatives of individuals whose lives have been taken or whose health has suffered after years of talcum powder. I see that my time is about to expire, so I'd like to yield back, and I would like to call okay. I'm going to ask Mr. Grothman if you have questions.
Okay. This is a question for any one of the three of you, though it was prompted by Mr. Salter's testimony. You say all along Johnson & Johnson knew the connections between talc and cancer. Is that true? You said all along Johnson & Johnson knew the connections between talc or baby powder and cancer. Is that true? Is that what you said?
Yes, I would say that's correct. Obviously, we had our trial back in 2016, so I was privy to a lot of the evidence that was put forth that showed that they knew about it as early as the 80s.
Could you expand a little bit on that? Like what type of testing, or they knew there were correlations between their product and cancer?
I'm not familiar with exactly what type of testing that was done, but I was only a witness to some of the documents that were presented during trial.
Okay. Does either Dr. McTiernan or Mr. Faber know a little bit how much they were covering up, what they were covering up, and how long they were covering up?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Grothman. As Mr. Salter mentioned, there's a great deal of documentary evidence showing that a number of companies, including Johnson & Johnson, found positive test results of their talc for the presence of asbestos fibers going back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. I'm happy to share those results with you.
That's fine. They didn't care. Any follow-up studies? Maybe we ought to reduce this or that in the product?
So at the time, these results were shared by a number of parties with FDA. FDA considered whether or not to regulate talc or to come up with a system to ensure that talc was free of asbestos. And ultimately, in 1976, under pressure from industry, FDA agreed to allow industry to self-regulate, provided they used a particular testing method that could detect some, but not all of the asbestos that might be present in talc.
And you think asbestos is what causes the cancer?
There's no doubt whatsoever that asbestos can contribute to mesothelioma and other forms of cancer and disease. That's why, beginning in 1972, the OSHA set standards for asbestos. It's why more than 50 other nations, although not yet the United States, have banned the use of asbestos.
Johnson & Johnson also makes pharmaceuticals?
That's correct.
Is there any reason why you think they'd be any more careful with pharmaceuticals or than they are with these other products?
That's a great question.
If that morality, does that morality spread throughout the company?
As I'm sure you know, Mr. Grothman, pharmaceutical drugs are subject to pre-market review by FDA. Correct. By contrast, personal care products like talc are not. And so we essentially rely on an honor system. We trust companies to monitor the ore, to test the ore for the presence of asbestos. We trust companies to test the products that are sent to them for asbestos. We trust these companies to conduct marketplace surveillance, but they have no duty to do those tests.
Would common sense, and I hate to set up anything new, but would common sense tell you that when you're putting something on your skin that there's the potential over time to have something bad happen?
Mr. Grothman, most consumers assume, and there's been a lot of research done on this question, that FDA has actually reviewed these products for safety before we put them on our bodies every day. I think if you walked outside the Rayburn building and asked anyone on the street, they would assume that shampoos, soaps, lotions have been tested and regulated by the FDA.
I give you and Dr. McTiernan one more general question. Juries can always reach conclusions that are wrong, I suppose. But in both of your opinion, is there any doubt in your mind that the, I guess what do you call it, baby powder that was sold by Johnson & Johnson has a connection to cancer? I mean, do you feel after looking at the evidence that that's something that's subject to debate?
Oh, I can answer from my review of the scientific literature, and I believe that talcum powder products do cause ovarian cancer. Yes, it's clear. There have been 24 case control studies that have been conducted over the last 40 years. Over 14,000 women with ovarian cancer have been interviewed for these studies and have given information, and even more women without ovarian cancer. And the results are really consistent. So I do believe, yes, that those products.
I maybe missed it. Is it off the market now?
Pardon?
Is it off the market now? the product, is it off the market now?
No, these are still on the market.
Sir.
So it's still on the market as almost a proven carcinogen?
There are now at least 2,000 products that contain talc that are available for sale today, of which more than 1,000 are loose powders or pressed powders, therefore posing the risk of things that are used around the nose and mouth that might be inhaled. It only takes one fiber lodged in the lung to contribute to mesothelioma decades later. And that's why many organizations and, frankly, many countries have required some sort of warning label, especially for children under the age of 3, when using these products that contain talc.
Thank you. Your time has expired, Mr. Grothman. I would just say that I don't think common sense would dictate that when people apply things to their skin, they would ever expect cancer. I just don't see that happening. Anyway, next person up is Ms. Tlaib. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, all 3 of you, so much. And Mr. Salter, thank you so much. My father had cancer, and he passed on at 67, cardiac arrest, but I was very, very much appreciative of your honesty and your testimony, and thank her so much for bringing attention to this. This will truly always be her legacy, to be able to at least protect other women. Today's hearing is significant. I think people are not realizing, corporate greed is a type of cancer in our democracy right now. And it's true. It's people questioning the science, questioning real, actual data that says exposure to these products hurts our families, our residents. Just last week, the Food and Drug Administration issued a safety alert confirming that asbestos was found in makeup product samples from Claire's, stores like Claire's and Justice, which are the stores that my residents go to, working folks, working families. They don't go to the bougie, Macy's counter. I'm being serious. These are targeting working class people, companies that manufacture and sell these makeup products to young girls, many of them of color. The FDA safety alert states, and I quote, "The FDA requested that Claire's recall the products because they should not be used by consumers. Claire's has refused to comply with the FDA's request, and the agency does not have authority to mandate a recall." However, later on after that, Claire's has since voluntarily complied. But even reading that just now, it shook me. And I know I'm new. But, before I came here, I honestly thought FDA's got it covered. EPA's got it covered. I see what happened in Flint, in Michigan. And so being here, the products mentioned in the safety alerts include like eyeshadows, these are things that I see my nieces in their little, the younger girls are starting to put all kinds of stuff on their face. I wasn't allowed to wear makeup until I was 18, but, it's true, it's changing because they're really focusing on our young girls. And so, Mr. Faber, your organization's devoted so much in helping consumers make right decisions. I know the Ecology Center in Michigan, I sat on their board for years, testing car seats that had toxins in them, kids' car seats. Corporate greed is so dangerous. It makes us look blindly at the science, at real data and information. And it's not like we don't want you, we want you to do well. We support, who doesn't? But we don't want it in exchange for people dying. So in the context of makers of talcum baby powder and so forth, if you were to make a decision, if you were in my spot, what are some of the specific things? You had mentioned 40 other countries had what, 1,400 restricted already? Where I think, what is ours? How many you said?
Nine,
and you just said 2,000 products are on the market right now. What would you ask us to do on behalf of our residents right now at this point?
Well, the good news is that Chairman Pallone, Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, is now working with Congressman Shimkus to craft legislation that would give the FDA these basic powers to order a recall if a product is contaminated, to review ingredients if the ingredients have been linked to cancer or reproductive harm. The other good news is that many of the companies that in the 70s fought giving FDA this power now support bipartisan legislation like the kind being developed by Mr. Pallone and Mr. Shimkus to give FDA these basic powers, the ability to know whether or not something's contaminated, to order a recall, to stop the production of contaminated products, all powers that FDA has for other categories but does not have today for cosmetics.
I read, and I don't know if my colleagues know this, but I believe that this is a $62 billion industry in America right now. And they can't just put a disclaimer, anything, any information out there, education on what these products are. But to think that asbestos, which is living, breathing in your body, it takes a while, it's like a slow death, is in these products is unbelievable. I want to ask, maybe afterwards we can talk, but I really want to put these products on my congressional website. I want to see if my colleagues won't let me do that, because I want to put it on my website and provide this information to these young girls and try to increase education, because I can't wait for this legislation to pass for people to stop dying. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tlaib. Ms. Miller, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy and Ranking Member Cloud, and thank you to all of you all for being here today. Mr. Salter, I grieve with you. I understand the tight bonds there are between a mother and a son, and I also held my mother-in-law when she lost her 34-year-old son, and I grieve with you. It's very sad. Like many of my colleagues here today, I'm troubled by the findings and the experiences that we have heard. For years, consumers have utilized products that contain talc without so much as a second thought. We have used it ourselves. I've bought products from both Claire's and used baby powder for years and years, and used it on my children as well. It is even more concerning that people have known about these carcinogens in the products and have put them on store shelves regardless. Mr. Faber, I agree that we need oversight to ensure that products put on store shelves are safe. However, we must also ensure that regulations placed on these companies are not so stringent that they may halt production altogether. It's such a fine line to walk. How would you suggest that we ensure more testing is done without stifling the research and the innovation that it takes?
Thank you for the question. We've worked very closely with companies like J&J, Procter & Gamble, Revlon, Estee Lauder, and L'Oreal, as well as many small companies who are just the real innovators in this industry, to craft legislation that would give FDA the power to review and, if necessary, regulate contaminants linked to cancer, birth defects, or reproductive harm, but would recognize the differences between very large companies like Procter & Gamble and very small companies that are going to provide the most innovative products in our economy. So I think the evidence that FDA can provide this oversight is all of the success we already see in the drug sector, the medical device sector, among food companies. I don't think it's hard to imagine striking a balance where FDA can ensure that these everyday products don't contain ingredients linked to cancer or reproductive harm, and that we continue to have many of these everyday products in our home. There are certainly going to be cases where chemicals or contaminants are so dangerous that they shouldn't be allowed in these everyday products, but there are literally thousands and thousands of ingredients available to formulators, and companies make products every day that don't include many of the chemicals and contaminants that I've mentioned in my testimony.
Is there a way to ensure that companies institute stringent testing procedures rather than relying upon the FDA?
We've relied on self-regulation now for more than 60 years. When Congress first began to consider whether or not to give these powers to FDA in the 1950s, and when Congress gave FDA the power to regulate chemicals in food and chemicals in 1958 and chemicals in colors in 1960, we instead chose to rely on industry self-regulation with regards to cosmetics. I think today's testimony and the support of so many cosmetic companies for more regulation is evidence that relying on self-regulation no longer makes sense.
What steps can Congress take to help empower companies and the FDA to utilize safe products?
The first step is giving FDA the power to identify those ingredients that have been linked to cancer or birth defects and reproductive harms, and making an assessment of whether or not, first and foremost, those ingredients and contaminants should be in these products at all, or whether they should be restricted to certain levels, as many other countries, more than 40 other countries have done. For the most part, most countries, when they look at these questions of the safety of these ingredients, have decided to restrict them to levels at which they would not pose any harm. Now, that's certainly not the case for a contaminant like asbestos. There's simply no safe level of asbestos. If we cannot sell products that are free from asbestos, they shouldn't be sold at all. But for most of the ingredients that have been regulated around the globe, countries like Canada, countries in Europe, countries in Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, Australia, have generally taken the step of restricting chemicals to certain amounts so that we're not exposed to so much of that chemical that we would be at an increased risk of cancer or other serious harms.
Thank you. I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Ms. Presley, you have 5 minutes.
I want to thank all of the witnesses for joining us again today. And Mr. Salter, I echo the sentiments of my colleagues. Death is a certainty of life. However, her death was premature and could have been avoided. Evidence supports that there was what I would consider to be predatory marketing, and understanding that black women are, I think, the #1 consumers of beauty products, and specifically of this powder. So I thank you for turning your pain into activism and to making sure that no other family knows the pain that you do. It's important to note that amongst the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women that have used Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder, the product was particularly popular with women of color. Johnson & Johnson tailored their marketing strategy to women of color almost 30 years ago. An internal memo that I would like to enter into the record, dated August 5th, 1992, entitled Johnson's Baby Powder, Major Opportunity, shows a usage of 52% among African Americans and 37.6% usage rate among Hispanics. This memo also details a plan to implement a Hispanic media program and to launch a black print media marketing effort accordingly. Mr. Chair, I would like to submit this memo into the record. Dr. McTiernan, in your meta-analysis, you surveyed the landscape of studies conducted on the safety of Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Do any studies prior to the 1992 memo, which I just submitted, confirm the link between the use of talcum powder and ovarian cancer?
Yes, definitely. Studies as early as 1982 found an increased risk of up to 2 times increased risk of ovarian cancer in women who are using these products.
And is that for any use, and black women were just disproportionately at risk? I think that report that you're referencing indicated that black women were 3 times more likely to develop ovarian cancer based upon their usage. Is that correct?
That study did not have enough black women to make specific comments on them in that paper. There were some later studies in 2016, 2015. One focused only on black women, and they did find increased risk of at least 50% for ever use of talcum powder products and risk of ovarian cancer. Another study was able to look at both black and Latina women, as well as white women, and found similar increased risk. So it really seems to, at least for these separate race ethnic groups, for blacks, Latinas, and white women, it has been shown to increase risk.
So anyone was at risk that was using talcum powder in their genital perineal, but women of color were seen at a higher risk because the studies indicated that they used it more.
Definitely.
Okay.
The study that focused on them, there were at least 50% were using those regularly.
Okay. So for well over half a century, tests confirmed instances in which Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder was contaminated, and yet the company moved forward with aggressively marketing its potentially dangerous product to women of color despite these consequences. Furthermore, a study by George Washington University even found that black women in particular, again, used talcum powders in the genital area at higher rates than the rest of the population. From Johnson & Johnson's documented early 90s marketing acumen, I must assume that they did know this. Okay. So how could talcum powder use in the genital area over an extended time period lead to ovarian cancer? Why does it specifically?
The exact mechanism is still needs to be studied, but we have several potential. One is inflammation, that talc or the other constituents in it can get in up to around the fallopian tubes and ovaries, can cause inflammation, and we know that inflammation can cause cancer. There are some other potential mechanisms that have been studied in ovarian cancer cells or in ovarian cells, and these look like many of the hallmarks of cancer can occur from application of talc.
And just for the record, I'd like to state, you know, every consumer wants to be respected for their purchasing power and marketed, but, you know, nobody wants to be harmed and hurt by companies peddling dangerous products in the process. It's really just inexcusable, and I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues and the subcommittee to lead the charge and to make sure that companies are held accountable in this regard. Mr. Salter, were there any warning labels placed on any of the talc products your mother used, warning of the increased risk of ovarian cancer?
No, not one single one. Obviously, we use this, you know, from generation. My grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, my mom. So obviously, in the African American community, it's a staple for usage for hygienic freshness. And not one single time has there been any label that stated or highlighted the risk of using this product whatsoever.
And do you believe that women have the right to know the facts about the cancer risks associated with talcum powder products?
Oh, without a doubt. You know, I feel that had we have known that, my mother may have still been here among countless other women that are battling this disease right now. They could have at least been given the option to choose to use this product or not, and knowing their risk, but they did not have that option to do so.
Your time has expired. Thank you, Ms. Presley.
Thank you.
Mr. Cloud, 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks again for being here. One of the things, you know, as we look for a solution in this, it's kind of a, I guess the puzzle for me is the FDA approval process here can tend to be politicized. And we talk about, you know, the regulation over the food industry, but we know that there are carcinogens still in food that is available in the market. We can look at the opioid crisis that was in large part driven not by illegal drugs, but by legal drugs. And so what happens a lot of times in a regulatory environment is that it actually favors the bad actors in the sense of the people most likely, or the companies most likely to be helped in a situation like this or favored would be a Johnson & Johnson. When I think it's two-thirds, the industry has 3.6 million domestic jobs. Two-thirds of those are in companies less than 50 employees. I think labeling is probably an easy solution, but when it comes down to granting FDA expansive new regulatory authority, how do we do that in a way that's properly scalable and effective?
Thank you for the question. To be clear, the legislation that has been introduced in the Senate by Senator Feinstein and Senator Collins, and that is being developed now by Chairman Pallone and Mr. Shimkus, does not anticipate creating a pre-market review program like we have for pharmaceutical drugs or devices. The Feinstein-Collins bill and the drafts that are being developed by others simply imagine that FDA would be given the power to review the most controversial ingredients in personal care products and then set a limit on those ingredients. Formulators would then be given a limit around which to reformulate their products if indeed those particular chemicals were in those products. And I want to emphasize that most of the 88 chemicals that companies themselves have reported that are linked to cancer or birth defects or reproductive harm in men and women are not in most products. They are in some products. And in most cases, when other countries have looked at these chemicals, they've not simply banned them, but placed restrictions around them, around which formulators have to reformulate. And so I think I just want to be very clear that we're not imagining, no one's proposing, to my knowledge, a pre-market review program, but instead giving rules of the road to cosmetic and other personal care companies that they would have to reformulate around. One of the, and in particular, giving FDA the power, if necessary, to require a warning. In this case, a warning would seem to be a sort of an obvious solution. Mrs. Dingell has introduced legislation in past Congresses to require a warning. Some companies have now begun to put warnings related to ovarian cancer on these talc-containing products. And even if there's a very small amount of asbestos present, and again, the detection methods we have now cannot ultimately prove that a product is asbestos-free, a warning would at least alert consumers to this potential risk and allow them to make their own choices.
That was going to be my next question, in the sense of, from a scientific standpoint, what testing mechanisms are there available? Asbestos is not always in talc. Is that my understanding?
Well,
and
so
then
that's right.
How do you? Is there testing methods available to find out?
So I'm not a geologist, but I will share that there are basically 3 testing methods available to determine whether or not asbestos has co-mineralized with talc, whether the talc might contain asbestos. One is called X-ray diffraction. The other is called polarized light microscopy, or PLM, and the last one is called transmission electron microscopy, or TEM. And these detection methods get more and more refined, from XRD to PLD to TEM. The important point is that none of them are an absolute guarantee that there is no asbestos present in the talc. They can magnify the sample to a level that is incredibly precise, but none of these methods can ever provide a guarantee that a talc-based product is completely free of asbestos.
Mr. Chairman, I have 3 documents from the Personal Care Products Council, a trade association who represents companies that make products such as cosmetics and baby powder. These documents are 2 statements by the association's president, CEO, Leslie Westein, indicating their eagerness to work with the FDA and Congress. I ask unanimous consent to include these documents in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
And before I give Congressman Khanna his time, I acknowledge the memo Congresswoman Presley submitted is without objection, so ordered, entered into the record. Thank you. Congressman Khanna, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to recognize you, Mr. Slater. Thank you for being here. My heart goes out to you for your loss, and I appreciate your courage in showing up and trying to make a difference on this. I want to focus my questions on Representative Presley's memo that she introduced. I find it, frankly, quite shocking. As I understand the situation, by 1982, we understood the risks of some of the talcum powder and the link to cancer-causing activity. And yet, Representative Presley has a memo 10 years later from 1992 that Johnson & Johnson is intentionally trying to sell more of this product to African Americans and the Hispanic American community. Dr. McTiernan, do you think Johnson & Johnson acted in deliberate disregard for the risks? And how would you characterize that memo where they are deliberately selling a product to African Americans and Hispanics knowing some of these risks?
I haven't seen the memo, but I do agree that it's questionable if there's attempt to get people to use these products more if there's any amount of risk. This isn't a product, talcum powder products in the genital area is not required for health. It's not like a medication where you look at the benefit and risk of something and tell the person this is the benefit, this is the risk. We don't have that situation here. We have something that's not necessary for health, and so it was being marketed for other reasons. It concerns me that there wouldn't be regulation that could oversee something like this. If there are risks to a product, we would like to be able to tell people what the risks are, and then realizing that for them benefit may just be some other reason other than a health benefit.
Let me ask this, which any of the panelists can answer. Do you think Johnson & Johnson would have acted differently if we were talking about Caucasians and not African Americans or the Hispanic community?
Could you repeat the question?
Sir, the memo that Representative Presley suggests is that Johnson & Johnson had a deliberate strategy to market this product to the African American community and to the Hispanic community, knowing, one can only assume they knew because 10 years earlier there was a study linking this product to cancer.
They did.
Do you think people there may have acted differently if the risk was to the Caucasian, to the white community, as opposed to the African American and Hispanic community? Do you think they were more indifferent to some of the suffering because it was minority communities?
Growing up in a, let's say, a less than perfect scenario where we didn't grow up with a lot of money, poverty levels, tough life, but we made do with what we had. There were not a lot of resources that were available for us to learn more about different products. We did what other generations did. Products that was used by forefathers, great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, that was the way of life. Now, I've seen memos myself where J&J, Johnson & Johnson, targeted those minorities, and personally, I felt like they targeted because of lack of education, that those group of people were easy targets. They used the product mostly, and they specifically target those people, knowing the harm that they were causing with their product, and they valued that over human life with profit. So yes, I think they would have treated Caucasian differently because of the money that they were making targeting minorities.
I just want to say for the record, what you said is absolutely disgusting if Johnson & Johnson did that, targeting people who didn't have an education. I mean,
yes, sir.
It's appalling. Mr. Faber, do you have any comments?
I would just add that all of the companies that used talc were well aware of the presence or the potential presence of asbestos in talc going back to the 1970s. It was never a secret that talc could co-mineralize with asbestos. Ultimately, the companies were successful in persuading FDA to allow them to rely on a method of testing that could not rule out the presence of asbestos in talc. So, and I think it's probably critical to remember that when given the chance to require a warning, FDA declined to do so twice, even though it has required warnings on products that arguably pose less risk to consumers than products that would contain asbestos.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khanna. Our next questioner is Mr. Connolly. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. And Mr. Salter, I join with my colleagues in expressing deep sympathy to you and your family for your loss. I know that we're joined today by a number of people who care enough about this issue to be here today, and I welcome all of you, and particularly those of you from Virginia. Mr. Faber, the Food and Drug Administration exists for what purpose?
To protect the safety of consumers.
Protect the safety of consumers, and so we expect that the FDA is looking at our food supply and our pharmaceutical supplies to ensure their safety. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And for example, I'm going back, but I think I'm correct that the FDA did a great job, unlike Europe, in regulating thalidomide. And as a result, the tragedies that occurred in Europe were minimized or did not occur here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So when it does its job, it can be a powerful force for consumer protection and consumer safety. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So when it comes to cosmetics, what does the law say the FDA can do? And or what does it limit the FDA from doing?
So the law that's in place now is simply the law that was enacted in 1938, which prohibits a product from being adulterated. That is, in general, prohibits a product from having a substance that would be akin to a poison, that would cause the sort of acute reaction that might send you to the hospital. In general, the law has not given the FDA to assess the chronic risks that might come from everyday use, from repeat exposure to chemicals applied to the body that might ultimately contribute to cancer or reproductive harm.
So let me make sure I understand the distinction you're making. So if I had a cosmetic product loaded with cyanide, FDA would catch that and ban it.
Well, not exactly. That product would be adulterated. It would be per se illegal. If FDA were aware that the product was for sale, it could use its seizure powers to go into the marketplace and take those products off the market. But FDA could not stop me from producing it under its authorities under the FFDCA, nor could it order me to recall that product under the FFDCA.
It would have to seize it.
It would have to go to the Department of Justice in order to get that product off the market.
But that would be an immediate threat.
Correct.
In this case, in terms of the adulteration of a cosmetic with traces of asbestos, that is not an immediate threat. That's a long-term cumulative threat to somebody's health. Is that correct?
So FDA, in the statement that it released in response to the finding asbestos in products sold at Claire's stores, did say that the presence of asbestos renders a product adulterated, and ultimately that is why they asked, didn't demand, but asked Claire's to clear the market to recall that product. And to my knowledge, that's the first time that FDA has said in that sort of statement that the presence of asbestos renders a product adulterated.
When was that?
That was last week, sir.
Last week. But we have testimony that Johnson & Johnson and FDA were aware of the risks of this adulteration going back to the 1970s. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So why did it take over 40 years for FDA to take any kind of action that starts to look decisive?
Beginning in the early 1970s, once FDA was alerted to the presence of asbestos in talc products, FDA considered whether to require warnings or to otherwise regulate talc-containing products because of the risk that these products would include a carcinogen. Ultimately, FDA was persuaded that the new testing method developed by the industry's trade association would be sufficient to ensure that those products would be free from asbestos. The evidence shows that is simply not the case, that the testing method that was developed by what used to be called the CTFA and is now called the PCPC could not guarantee that those products would be asbestos-free. And I think, in retrospect, FDA would likely agree, if they were called to testify, that it was a mistake to rely on industry's assurances in 1976 that this testing method would guarantee that these products are safe.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I think this is a tragic case study that gives the lie to those who want to propound that the Federal government's hobnail boot is on the neck of business. If it only let up, everything would be fine. When we mindlessly deregulate or don't regulate to protect the public, this is what can happen. And I hope we will all remember that. And frankly, I hope this hearing will lead to some legislative direction that empowers FDA, especially in the cosmetic field. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. We're going to do a quick lightning round because a few members have a second round of questions, and we'll keep these to 2 minutes this time. And so please answer as briefly as you can. I'm going to start with Mr. Salter. You stated your mother used Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder for 35 years, correct?
Yes, sir. Since the day she was born, all her life. So longer than 35 years for sure.
And your mother used it primarily for personal hygiene purposes, is that right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And she did not receive any kind of warning?
None whatsoever.
And you believe that would have made a difference, at least a warning?
Without a doubt. At least we would have had, my mother would have had a choice to use a product or not use a product, considering that she knew the risk of its usage.
And what was her life like after diagnosis of the cancer?
It was the most degrading process I've ever seen, to watch a loved one deteriorate, and to think that that happened because of use of a product that's commonly sold on every single shelf in just about every store across this country is devastating. So it was a hard process, but she fought for her life, and she did it with a smile on her face.
You know, you're representing a lot of people who are sitting behind you, who are looking to you to voice their concerns. If you had something to say based on what you've heard today at this hearing, what would it be?
I would say that awareness is key. So many people are blind to the fact that this product is harmful, and I'm thankful that we're bringing light to the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Salter.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
yield back. Our next person, Mr. Cloud, would you like? Mrs. Miller is going to have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've had several thoughts listening today. I always pack baby powder with me everywhere I go, but I use it in my shoes for sweaty feet. Just a habit I've had for years, that, you know, to put it in tennis shoes, whatever. But it kind of reminds me that there's now a warning on cigarettes that the use of tobacco is harmful to your health. So I can understand that there are warnings that are available. I had one more question, really for Mr. Faber, but I stopped because my time was out. But it basically was along the same lines of before. I understand that the FDA has a voluntary cosmetic registration program which allows for reporting from companies to help increase safety for consumers. What suggestions would you have for increasing that participation in that program?
Well, I'm glad to share that the vast majority of cosmetics companies, large and small, believe that registration should be required, in part so that FDA can alert them if an ingredient has been contaminated and it might have been used in one of their products. I'm also happy to share that as Senator Feinstein and Senator Collins developed their bill, and I presume Mr. Pallone and Mr. Shimkus will as well, they've developed an abbreviated registration process for small companies who don't have the same resources as Procter & Gamble or Estee Lauder or L'Oreal or other big companies. So I think there's a way to allow FDA to know where companies are and what's in their products, and ultimately to know if products are hurting people, as is sometimes the case, without placing significant burdens, especially on the small innovators in the cosmetics industry.
Okay, thank you. I've run out again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Ms. Presley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your products still contain talc, is that correct? There's still talc? There's still talc in your products?
We found 2,000 products that are for sale today that contain talc, including more than 1,000 that are looser pressed powders are used around the face and mouth and are likely to be inhaled.
Including your baby products, correct?
There are still baby products that contain talc. There are also baby products that are made from cornstarch. Many of the companies that sold baby powders and still sell baby powders made from talc also sell baby powders made from cornstarch.
Excuse me, but in spite of the research and the science and the tragic loss of life, and you still would lead us to believe that your products are safe for consumption?
So I think what's important to remember is these are discretionary products. I think that's what's ultimately the real tragedy of asbestos in talc, is that we're not talking about things people need to survive, food, water, or even things people need to use to come to a meeting like this, shampoos and soaps and deodorants. These are sort of the definition of discretionary products, and that's why a warning and further regulation.
Sure, and I recognize you're not Johnson & Johnson, but I'm just, I'm just furious because what is the source of rebuke and retribution for these families? We can't return their loved ones to them, and so what can we do? Make sure this tragedy doesn't happen again. So I understand your science and what you're offering, but I just don't know how the consumers can have any true trust and faith here that they are safe in the consumption of these products. And they are, it is a person's prerogative. But if there's predatory marketing happening, there's a seduction happening here.
So if I were in your shoes or in Commissioner Gottlieb's shoes, I wouldn't wait another day to require a warning on all these products. FDA has twice refused to do so after receiving citizen petitions. They could tomorrow require a warning on any product that's containing talc so that consumers would know. That would be the first step and the easiest step we could take to protect consumers. The next step would be to really better understand whether it's even possible to produce these products without containing asbestos, and help companies. And if not, then there are plenty of alternatives available, including alternatives made with cornstarch.
Thank you, and that's what I was looking for. So, it's just to be prescriptive about where we go from here to prevent this tragic loss of life from happening to any other family.
Appreciate your questions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Presley. No more questions. So then we're going to move to closing statements. To conclude today's hearing, I want to thank our witnesses once again for discussing this critically important issue with our subcommittee. And in Mr. Salter's case, thank you for discussing your family's personal tragedy. My heart and my best wishes go out to all the families out here represented by all of you for your loss of your loved ones. And I want to thank all of you for traveling from all over the country to be here today with us. I said it earlier, but it bears repeating. The average adult in this country uses personal products 9 times daily. Consumers use these products trusting that they are safe and will not cause harm to themselves or their loved ones. Today's hearing was just our first step in protecting consumers from potentially hazardous or carcinogenic products. Following this hearing, I will work diligently with my staff in order to determine the best next steps, including any need for a continuing investigation into the matters discussed this morning. Thank you to everyone again for their time today.
I just echo those thoughts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for the participation in this committee. And Chairman, thank you for your leadership in this topic. And look forward to moving this forward. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. We are adjourned.